Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. I am genuinely excited about today's story because it pulls together three names you don't usually see in the same sentence, and the implications are huge for how we get around cities.
Okay, you have my attention already. The headline that crossed the wire on June 1st, 2026 is that Uber, an Israeli startup called Autobrains, and NVIDIA are teaming up to put Robotaxis on the streets of Munich.
Right, and the detail that makes my ears perk up is that this is Uber's very first serious attempt to bring fully autonomous ride-hailing to Europe, which has lagged well behind the United States and China on this front.
That European angle is fascinating, because when most people picture Robotaxis, they think of Waymo cars quietly circling Phoenix or San Francisco. Why has Europe been so slow? And why is Munich suddenly the chosen launchpad?
A few reasons stack up here. European regulators have historically been far more cautious about putting driverless vehicles on public roads, and Germany in particular has strict approval processes. But Munich has been positioning itself as a testing ground for exactly this kind of advanced mobility.
So Uber isn't just dropping cars there on a whim. They actually flagged plans last year to begin self-driving trials in Munich starting in 2026, which means this announcement is the culmination of groundwork that has been laid for quite a while.
Exactly. And the program only launches once it clears regulatory approval. So nobody is hailing a driverless ride tomorrow. But the structure of the deal is what I find genuinely clever, because each of the three partners brings a completely different piece of the puzzle.
Let's break that down, because I think the partnership structure is the real story here. Walk me through who is responsible for what, starting with the company most of our listeners already know, which is obviously Uber itself.
Uber brings the mobility network, which is the part people underestimate. They already have the app, the riders, the dispatching logic, the payments, and the demand data across entire cities. So they essentially provide the marketplace that any autonomous vehicle needs to actually be useful and profitable.
That makes sense, because a self-driving car with nobody to pick up is just an expensive science project. So Uber is the demand layer and the customer relationship. Where does NVIDIA fit into this three-way arrangement? Beyond the obvious fact that they make chips.
NVIDIA provides the underlying compute platform called DRIVE Hyperion, which is essentially the reference hardware and sensor architecture that the whole self-driving stack runs on. Think of it as the standardized brain and nervous system that the actual driving software gets installed onto.
And that leaves Autobrains, which is the name that most of our listeners have probably never heard before today. This is the Israeli startup out of Tel Aviv, and they are the ones actually writing the software that makes the car drive itself, correct?
That's right, and Autobrains is where the technology gets really interesting because their whole philosophy is different from the approach that companies like Waymo have championed in the United States for years. Their founder, Igal Reichelgauz, has been pushing a contrarian vision for a while now.
I love a good contrarian engineering story. So what exactly is the conventional approach that everybody else uses? And how does Autobrains claim to be doing something fundamentally different from the established Robotaxi playbook we have all gotten used to?
The dominant approach, exemplified by Waymo, leans heavily on expensive LiDAR sensors plus extremely detailed pre-mapped geofenced areas. The car basically already knows the neighborhood block by block, and it cross-references what it sees against that high-definition map to figure out where it can safely go.
So in that model, the intelligence is partly baked into the map itself, which is powerful, but also means you have to painstakingly map every single city before you can operate there. I can already see why that approach is so expensive and so hard to scale globally.
Precisely. And that is the bottleneck Autobrains is trying to blow past. Their system, which they brand as Liquid AI, uses what they call signature-based self-learning. And the goal is a car that generalizes to new situations rather than relying on having memorized the exact streets in advance.
Signature-based self-learning is a great phrase, but it is also a little abstract, so help me ground it. What is actually happening under the hood when this Autobrain system encounters, say, a cyclist swerving, or a delivery truck double parked in a narrow Munich street?
So instead of one gigantic monolithic neural network trying to handle everything at once, Autobrains decomposes driving into many smaller, context-specific models they call skills. Each skill is trained for a particular kind of scenario, and the system dynamically activates whichever skills are relevant to the situation unfolding right now.
That is a genuinely different architecture, and it reminds me a little of how the broader AI world has been moving toward agentic systems, where you have specialized agents handing tasks off to each other, rather than one model trying to be everything to everyone all at once.
You nailed the connection, and that is exactly why the press materials describe this as an agentic AI robotaxi program. The driving task gets broken into specialized decision-making agents, and the marketing language around agents is no longer just about chatbots writing emails. It is now steering actual vehicles.
Let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because this all sounds elegant in a press release. Breaking a problem into modular pieces is intellectually appealing, but driving is notoriously full of weird edge cases. Doesn't a modular system risk having gaps between the skills it was trained on?
That is the central engineering tension, and it is a fair challenge. The counterargument Autobrains makes is that their continuous self-learning approach lets the system build new signatures for novel situations incrementally, rather than needing a giant, expensive retraining cycle every time the world throws something genuinely unexpected at it.
And there is a cost angle buried in here too, right? Because if you do not need LiDAR and you do not need to pre-map every street, the hardware on each individual car gets cheaper, which matters enormously when you are trying to deploy a whole fleet.
That is arguably the most important business point in the entire story. Autobrains emphasizes that their system can run real-time responses using standard automotive sensors, mostly cameras rather than the costly sensor stacks that have made robotaxis so brutally expensive to build and operate at any meaningful scale.
Now, a camera-first philosophy is going to make a lot of listeners immediately think of Tesla, which has bet its entire autonomy program on vision rather than LiDAR. How does what Autobrains is doing relate to or differ from that very public Tesla approach?
It is a fair comparison, and they do share the conviction that cameras plus smart software can substitute for expensive sensors. The difference is architectural, because Tesla leans on one massive end-to-end network, whereas Autobrains explicitly decomposes the problem into those modular, self-learning skills we talked about earlier.
And there's a third name worth mentioning in this neighborhood, which is Mobileye, another Israeli company that has been doing driver assistance and autonomy for years. It really does feel like Israel has become a quiet powerhouse for the brains behind self-driving systems globally.
It absolutely has, and that ecosystem of talent is a big part of why Uber would look to an Israeli startup, rather than building everything internally. The deep bench of computer vision and sensor fusion expertise coming out of that country has been feeding the automotive world for over a decade now.
So if I'm connecting the dots correctly, the pitch is essentially a cheaper, more generalizable autonomy stack that does not need a custom-mapped city. That would explain the other phrase I keep seeing in the coverage, which is that the program is designed to be OEM-agnostic.
Yes, and OEM-agnostic is a deceptively boring term that hides a really big ambition. It means the software is not married to one specific carmaker's vehicle. In principle, the same Autobrains stack could be dropped into different car models from different manufacturers across different urban markets around the world.
That is a direct shot at the way the industry has worked so far, where autonomy has been these isolated, vertically integrated pilots tied to one company's specific cars in one specific city. Autobrains and Uber are basically arguing the future is a portable software layer instead.
And that framing matters for Uber especially, because Uber famously sold off its own in-house self-driving division years ago. Their current strategy is to be the network that partners with whoever has the best autonomy software, rather than spending billions trying to build the entire self-driving brain themselves.
That is a smart strategic pivot when you think about it, because it lets Uber stay asset-light and partner-agnostic, while everyone else burns capital on the hard robotics problem. But it also means Uber is making a real bet that Autobrains specifically can deliver on these ambitious claims.
It does, and that is where a healthy dose of skepticism is warranted. Because the autonomous vehicle space is absolutely littered with bold promises that slipped years past their deadlines. Plenty of companies have claimed generalizable, map-free, camera-first driving was just around the corner, and the corner kept moving.
That is the honest caveat we owe our listeners. The entire announcement is contingent on regulatory approval in Germany, and German authorities are not exactly known for rushing safety decisions, so there is a real chance the timeline stretches well beyond whatever optimistic dates get floated initially.
Completely agreed, and I would add that the proof will be in independent safety data, not in press releases from GTC Taipei. We have learned the hard way that demos on a sunny test track tell you very little about how a system handles a chaotic rainy night in a dense European city.
There's also a question I keep coming back to about pricing, because the entire promise of Robotaxis to ordinary riders was supposed to be cheaper trips once you remove the human driver from the cost equation. Do we have any sense of whether Munich riders will actually save money?
Nobody has published fares yet, and I would caution against expecting bargains on day one because the upfront cost of the vehicles, the sensors, the remote monitoring staff, and the regulatory compliance is enormous. The cheaper rides promise is real in theory, but it tends to arrive only after fleets reach genuine scale.
So let's zoom out and talk about why this particular announcement matters beyond just 3 companies issuing a joint press release. What does the Munich program signal about where the broader Robotaxi race is heading in the second half of 2026?
I think it signals that the center of gravity is shifting from the question of, can we build a robotaxi at all? Which has basically been answered in places like Phoenix, toward the much harder question of, can we scale this profitably across many different cities and many different regulatory regimes?
And Europe becomes the proving ground for that scaling question. Because if you can make a camera-first, OEM-agnostic software-defined system work under strict German regulation, you have a much stronger argument that the same approach travels to other markets without rebuilding everything from scratch each time.
Exactly, and it also intensifies the competitive pressure on the incumbents. Waymo has an enormous head start and a fantastic safety record in its operating areas, but its model is expensive and city by city. If the Autobrains philosophy works, it reframes what a winning long-term strategy in this industry even looks like.
There is also a geopolitical and industrial dimension worth naming, because this is an Israeli software company, an American mobility giant, and an American chip company collaborating to launch in Germany. That is a genuinely global supply chain for something as local and physical as a city taxi ride.
It really is, and it underscores how autonomous driving sits at this intersection of advanced AI software, specialized semiconductors, and old-fashioned ground transportation. NVIDIA providing the DRIVE Hyperion platform is the same NVIDIA dominating data center AI, which shows how their reach now extends from training clusters all the way down to the curb.
Before we wrap, I want to ask you the question our listeners are probably shouting at their headphones right now, which is simply this. As a rider, would you actually get into one of these Munich robotaxis on day one if you were visiting the city?
Honestly, I would, but with a caveat that reflects everything we just discussed. I would happily ride once there is real published safety data and once German regulators have signed off, because that approval is not a rubber stamp. The novelty of the technology alone would not be enough to win my trust.
That is a perfectly reasonable position, and I think it captures the mood of this whole moment in autonomy, which is cautious optimism backed by a demand for evidence rather than hype. The technology has clearly matured, but trust still has to be earned ride by ride.
Well said, and the thing I will be watching most closely over the coming months is whether the OEM-agnostic, software-first thesis actually holds up once these cars hit real Munich traffic, because that is the claim that could genuinely reshape the economics of the entire global robotaxi industry.
That is the perfect note to leave our listeners thinking about, because today's story really is less about one city and more about a fundamentally different bet on how autonomy scales. Thank you, Laura, for breaking down all of these moving pieces so clearly for everyone.
My pleasure, Chris, and thank you to everyone listening for spending part of your day diving this deep into the future of autonomous mobility with us. These are the stories that genuinely excite me, and I cannot wait to see how the Munich experiment unfolds from here.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.